built for business. Waiting. No one enjoys it. With Comcast Business, you can do less of it. Because Comcast Business Internet is up to 5 times faster than DSL from the phone company, which means less waiting for things like security backups and file downloads. Plus, it's a better value when you select the fastest plan. So do what nearly 1,000 businesses do every day and choose Comcast Business. Unless you'd prefer to wait. Switch to Comcast Business Internet. Then add 1 voice line and TV for just $34.90 a month for 2 years. And ask about their low price guarantee. Call 800-501-6000 or visit ComcastBusiness.com. That's 800-501-6000. Comcast Business. Built for business.
Offer ends 3/31/15. Restrictions apply. Equipment, taxes, and fees, including broadcast TV fee extra. Compares Comcast 100 megabits per second and 20 megabits per second DSL downloads.
From high above his mountaintop in Oklahoma, Watchman Larry Taylor brings you The Edge Portal, produced by Dorothy Crothers.
The data. The creator, he's bound by no such rule as time. He's at the beginning, at the end, and in the middle, all the way through, all the time.
You want answers? You want answers!
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Data?
Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded.
Who's gonna do it? You!
Very simple.
Stand a post.
No one would have believed in the early years of the 21st century that our world was being watched by intelligence greater than our own. They observe.
Data trails.
But as men busy themselves about their various concerns, they observe.
The creator.
The Bible says there comes to be a time when time is no more. I think of what?
A human given directions by the Holy Spirit. It's great stuff. Very simple. Very simple. Very simple.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special Sunday edition of the Edge Portal. Tonight, Larry is going to be interviewing Dan Gordon, an IDF soldier and a prolific writer. The main topic of discussion will be his latest book, Day of the Dead, Book 1, Gaza. Here's Larry.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you for a wonderful introduction. And I'll tell you what, this is a little special Sunday evening as far as I'm concerned. And I've got on the phone with me here today on the radio program someone that I have really, without knowing, somewhat followed for quite a few years. I've always enjoyed good movies. I've always enjoyed good books. Everybody knows Larry Taylor's a book hound, and I love good books. And I've been following Dan Gordon, who we've got on today, and I've been following him. I didn't even know it for a while. Let me read you just a little bit, and those that are hearing the program and on YouTube later can also go to the Amazon.com authors page for Dan Gordon, and I'm just going to read you a few things he's been involved with, okay? And he can correct me if I say something wrong, but some of his Hollywood films that he was screenwriter was like The Hurricane with Denzel Washington, Wyatt Earp, Kevin Costner, and one that I have really enjoyed. I enjoyed the book, and then I really enjoyed the movie, which is hard to find now, but I've got my own copy. It's called The Assignment, and that's with Ben Kingsley, and that is really, really an intriguing movie. I've watched that a number of times, and then he also was involved in, well, it's not a good way to say that, but I'll say the film Murder in the First, Passenger 57 with Wesley Snipes, which I have seen more than once or twice or 3 times. I've seen that one a number of times. That's a terrorist movie type, and excellent. And the data says that he's been a screenwriter for at least 15, and he can correct me, he's probably been more than that, but 15 Hollywood films. He's got a new book out we'll be talking about today, Day of the Dead, and as Dorothy said in the intro, Book 1, Gaza. Also, The Assignment, and this one is really good. I've just got it. I just read the first couple of sections in it, and it really struck me really heavy. It hit my heart, and it's one that I'd had to blink twice when I saw that he had written this book. I don't know why I hadn't stumbled across it, but it's called Postcards from Heaven. Really unique, and I want to talk with him later about the spacesuit, but that'll come a little bit later. And also, interestingly, and this is another TV movie or series that I followed for a number of years, he was the head writer, it says, for Michael Landon's long-running series, Highway to Heaven. And with us today is the guy that's involved in all of that, Dan Gordon. Welcome, Dan.
Oh, that is the loveliest introduction I've ever had. Thank you so much, Larry. Real pleasure to be with you.
Oh, my, I'll tell you, I appreciate so much you coming in and sharing with us. And wow, what can I say? I mean, when I begin to gather up the information, you know, it kind of boggled my mind because, you know, I'm one of those guys that I love powerful books, you know. And
mm-hmm.
you know, I follow guys like you probably know some of them, Brad Thor, Joel
yep.
C. Rosenberg, you know what I'm talking about. You know, of course, the late Tom Clancy, I you know, enjoyed all of his. And you know, when I've read some of yours and I've watched the movies, I didn't really do the connections in there with you per se at the time. But boy, when you know this thing came up about the book Day of the Dead, Book 1, Gaza. Oh, my. When I got that, you know, and at first Amazon began to try to slow the date that it was actually physically coming out. Of course, I was trying to get the physical copy, the hard copy, you know, of the book. And that was a little difficult at first, but now they're really readily available from Amazon.com for people. And I'm not sure the other locations. You may have other locations people can look or purchase them.
Yep, it's at Amazon.com. It's at Barnes & Noble. There is a special Christian edition, which I did in connection with Liberty University, that's devoid of any profanity or overly graphic descriptions, and people can get that at Day of the Dead Liberty Edition, all one word, dayofthedeadlibertyedition.com. And they can also go to libertyhillpublishing.com and go to the bookstore that they'll see at the top of the web page, and they'll find it there as well. So it's available in a number of outlets, and my own website will be up and running shortly. We've been having some trouble with the bozos who've been putting it together, but eventually they'll get it right. I think they must have been involved in Obamacare at one point in time, but eventually they will get it right, and we'll get it up there too. But it's selling very well in Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and people are very much enjoying the read. And the other day I got as good a compliment as I've ever gotten, and that was the reviewer at WorldNet Daily said, no one has ever gotten inside the mind of a terrorist since Tom Clancy as Dan Gordon has. And I thought, well, that's as good as it gets. I'll take that one and run with it. So,
well, that one is an absolute. I mean, that one's solid. When you get and I can agree with him because, you know, I'm a fan of Tom Clancy, and he wrote his books and he built them along with the characters so intricately that by the beginning of the first few chapters, you're already knowing the people. And, you know, I just have to say, this was really a great read. I mean, it made me want book 2 the minute I closed book 1. And I have to say, and this is what, you know, and I do know, and we'll get into that in a few minutes, but I do know the reasoning and the direction you were going in when you wrote this book. And of course, for those that don't know it, you were really involved and have been for I don't know how many years, but quite a few years, I'm sure, with the Israeli Defense Forces. You're in the reserve there, and you're over there a lot. And, of course, you know, I stumbled upon pictures of you when I know Richard Shaw, and when he was in Israel and you guys were talking and looking at the, I guess, the crashed Gaza rockets, so to speak, you know, I saw some of the photographs where y'all were checking all that out, and he was, you know, he put you in his the latest Watchers DVD that he and L.A. Marzulli worked up, and really, really good stuff. I mean, really. So you were intricately involved in, well, I guess you could say, in the Israelis' wars, so to speak.
Yeah, I've been in, I've been in 6 Middle Eastern wars. I first put on the uniform of the Israel Defense Forces in 1973. My first war was the Yom Kippur War in 1973. I was born in the United States, but I was raised both in Israel and in the United States. And when I was of draft age, I was living in Israel, and they scooped me up, and I have been very proudly wearing that uniform for now, good Lord, going on to 44 years. I think I'm the oldest serving reserve officer still in a combat unit in the Israeli Army. I could be wrong. There might be another guy, but I think I'm pretty close to the dinosaur there. And like I say, after having been in 6 Middle Eastern wars, having known some of the truly great military leaders as close personal friends of that country, who I've known over the years, and some of them grew up with. I mean, Raful Eitan, who was one of the greatest Israeli generals there ever was, I knew from the time I was 16 years of age, since I was a high school boy. He was a farmer who lived down the road from the kibbutz where I lived, and he was a good friend of my parents, my foster parents, who raised me, and he could never quite figure me out, but we were always good friends, and he imparted a great deal of wisdom to me. So I gained an awful lot of insight into that. At one point in time, the unit that I was in when I was a young man, young reservist in my early 30s, did a good deal of counterterrorism work in the north of Israel. At that time, I was a squad leader, a sergeant, and a company sniper. And so I worked with some wonderful people and had the benefit of knowing people both on the military side and on the academic side who really made a study of terrorism, who I consider dear, dear friends. And I also have as one of my best friends and foxhole buddies. We went through 2 wars together and literally have been under fire many times together, is Israel's former ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren. So I've kind of, over the last 40 years, developed the contacts that allowed me for the first time to really write about that subject in the way that I had always wanted to write about it. I think I put pretty much everything I know about the Middle East and what's going on there today and what I think is going to happen both there and in the United States in the near future into that book. I don't know how to do it any better, and I didn't leave anything on the floor. And they'll find 2 things. One, a really fun, entertaining, big Tom Clancy international combat espionage. If they're, geek freak, weapon freak, techno freak guys, they'll enjoy that part of it. If they're military guys, they'll certainly enjoy that part of it. I think it's probably the best treatment of how the Israeli army engages in combat in modern times that I, will immodestly say that anybody's done. I haven't seen anything any better on it. But it's also meant to be a really loud and clear warning. I'm like a person with 2 mothers, one biological mother and one adopted mother, and I love them both. And I have 2 homelands. One is America and one is Israel, and love them both very dearly. And I feel like shouting from the rooftops a warning to my American homeland that we don't know what's headed our way. We've got our heads in the sand, at least our administration does. Our military guys know what's coming our way, but our administration has its head up an orifice where the sunlight never penetrates. And we're in for some tough times here, and we better get ready for it quick, because the people we're going to be up against are good at what they do, are absolutely ruthless, have no mercy whatsoever, and are coming our way.
I'll tell you what, that book, it just sounded all the way through it with warnings. I mean, over and over and over, like ringing a bell. And I really appreciate the way you put the characters together. they all appeared in the beginning, Dan, to be a bunch of misfits. You know, the heroes appeared to be a bunch of misfits. I mean, how could you put a puzzle together with pieces like this? I mean, you know, it's like putting a square peg in a round hole almost.
Well, I wanted a cast of people who, on paper, if you were looking on paper, you'd say, wow, these are the best guys for the job. But if you ever really got into who they were, you'd say you just put together the worst possible people you possibly could. And then how do you build an effective unit out of those characters? And that was the fun of it as for a writer, was how do you then, you know, that's the meat of the drama, is not what a person's glowing characteristics are, but what are their failings and how do they deal with those? So that's the fun of it, and it's, at the end of the day, it's also, which I haven't run into that many times in my life, it's really a story of faith. It's a story of where we think we know what we're doing, but the hand of the Almighty is the one that's on the tiller, not ours. We're a single stone in the mosaic. We don't see the whole design, but there is a creator that does, and that was something I was trying to pull off, and you know, hopefully did. Hello?
Hello, did I lose you, Dan?
Yep, for a second there.
Okay, we're here. We're all good to go. I'll tell you what. Go ahead with what you were saying. It's people that don't have that book. I just encourage them, get it, and read it thoroughly.
Well, I think if someone's planning to buy a book this year, that's the right one to get. I mean, first of all, it's the only one that I know of that features as the heroine a female, born-again Christian, drop-dead gorgeous, 35-year-old woman who has a very tortured past and who, at this point in her life, can neither confide in a CIA psychiatrist nor even her own pastor, and she's based on someone who I know. She's actually based on a couple of people I know. She's a graduate of Liberty University, which is a university I know and love. I founded a film school there in my late son's name called the Zachy Gordon Cinematic Arts Center, and it's the finest Christian film school in the world. So I knew those characters pretty intimately, and they're pretty real. And I think anybody who is looking for a read that will touch their intellect and touch their heart and touch their faith, and be a fun ride, but also one that'll make them think twice about where we're going, that book will do it all.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. One thing that was really interesting to me was the IDF would go in to the Gaza. It was almost the way you were writing it. It was because you could feel the apprehension, you could feel the adrenaline pumping, you could feel a little bit of fear. I mean, it was almost like literally you were with them riding in, especially that big old armored carrier that they drove in there, that monster. I like that monster truck or whatever it was that was put together, and it was just so powerful the way that you took. It's like you were there. I mean, that's how I felt.
Well, every combat scene in that book, and the combat scenes stretch back for 40 years. Pretty much every combat scene in that book I've either been in personally or know the people who were in. And that the one that you're describing, that is how I rode into Gaza in 2009 into a hellhole called Al-Tatra in what's called a Nagmachon armored personnel carrier, and unless one has had that experience and smelled those smells and heard the sound of machine gun fire and then rocket fire hitting up against the armor, you don't quite know what that's like until you do. It's a different ride. I'll tell you.
Wow, it was amazing. And one of the things that I found, it didn't really, I didn't have to scratch my head very much to figure out some of the leadership in America. I was able to do that, even with different names. I call it clues. You drop clues.
Yeah.
And also you dropped warnings in there. You embedded some warnings in that book. I don't know if you've read it, Dan, but William Fortune's book that he's got out called Day of Wrath.
No, I haven't read it. Huh?
Yeah, he didn't even want to write it, but he felt impressed to write it anyway. And it's not a pretty book. As far as, it's one of those dealing with the same situation you're trying to warn about. He's trying to do the same kind of warning, but it's a little powerful paperback, but it's really, really interesting. And this one, this is good. I mean, this, America, and I don't know how Israel is, it's hard for me to put how Israel is feeling about, do they feel abandoned over in Israel at the present time? Do they feel like nobody has their back hardly? How do the Israelis feel?
We feel that the American people have our back. I don't think you'll ever find any country on the face of the earth that loves America or Americans as much as Israel. I mean, I don't mean just identifies, but I mean truly loves America and loves Americans. If you see an American serviceman in Israel on leave, on shore leave, or coming out of the embassy if they're an embassy guard, or we have there's some U.S. manned listening posts in Sinai, and you can pretty well tell who an American service personnel is. They have a particular look on them. Generally, they can't pay for a meal in a restaurant or buy a drink. Someone picks up the tab for them. Israelis just love Americans, and we know the American people have our back. We do feel isolated in terms of the current administration, and I'll tell you, it may well be that the president has finally earned his Nobel Peace Prize, because I never thought I would live to see in my lifetime a point in time where Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Qatar, the Emirates, and Israel were all on the same page, nor did I ever think I'd see a time when we would be arrayed against Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the President of the United States of America. And so do I think that we feel isolated in terms of this administration? I think every ally that America has in the Middle East, every single ally without exception that America has in the Middle East, feels that they are being thrown under the bus, and feels that the current administration, for whatever insane reasoning, believes that it would be in the U.S. interest to have Iran be the most powerful military force in the Middle East, which of course would be absolute disaster, because Iran is the largest sponsor of state terror in the entire world. There is no sponsor of state terror greater than Iran. They're greater than North Korea. They're the worst of the worst. All of the money that Hezbollah gets, and Hezbollah is responsible for killing more Americans actually than Israelis. Hezbollah blew up the Marine barracks in the 1980s, killed I think 250 Americans on the spot, wounded hundreds more. Iran's responsible for half the IEDs that have taken limbs off our fighting men and women and killed our fighting men and women in Iraq and Afghanistan. All that comes from Iran, and if you cut a nuclear deal with them and then lift the sanctions on them, they will be getting, by most estimates, over $1 trillion, and that $1 trillion is going to go to fund the terrorist organizations that are going to be coming after us. And when I say us, I mean Israel and the United States. And it's as the King of Siam said in The King and I, is a puzzlement.
Absolutely. That's a good term, puzzlement. You're exactly right. One of the things since your book came out even is, and you wrote in the book, you were talking about connections of the Islamists coming in to work with Hamas and to build an operation somewhat off of their tunnel attacks and tunnel operations that they were doing. And then it wasn't any time, actually about the time your book came out or just right after that, that they began to see that ISIS was, even in Iraq, was working tunnel systems, already working the Hamas theory, so to speak, of war. And what's interesting on top of that, we began to have the little signs of, which they've tried to make, people not talk about, but the signs of ISIS being on our southern border, and the camps right across from Texas, and, and other areas. And all the warnings that you're putting, I mean, the signs are up. And I did enjoy, by the way, Dan, I really enjoyed the interview you had with Judge Pirro on Fox News. The only thing that it was too short. She didn't let you talk enough. But it
wasn't her fault. It was the day that that horse won the Triple Crown, and she was upset that we got cut short too. But I guess the horse was bigger news than either one of us. So there it was. But the way the book came about and the conceit of the book, this was our third war with Hamas in 5 years. And if you can imagine having to go to war 3 times in 5 years against a terrorist army that is not like Cuba, 90 miles away from your border. It is your border. And it's not just within rocket range, it's within pistol range. The first time I was ever shot at in my life, I was 16 years old, and I was volunteering on a kibbutz called Nahal Oz, which is a kibbutz on the border, on the 1948 internationally recognized border of Israel with Gaza, probably by the grandfather of some of the terrorists that we were up against today. And so this particular war, the first 7 or 8 days, Israel did everything humanly possible to not be in that war. We didn't want that war. No one in Israel wanted it. Not Netanyahu, not the military, not the civilian population. Absolutely no one. And they were very cunning about how they were going to drag us into war, because this was a war they planned for 5 years. And I can say that with certainty, because it took 5 years to dig those terrorist attack tunnels. So it wasn't as if the war started and then they said, well, let's dig some tunnels. That'll be a good idea and we'll use them. This was a project that took 5 years to build. So they began planning this war in 2009. 2009 is when they lost the first one of the wars with us. And that's when I went into Al-Tatra in that giant armored personnel carrier called the Nag Lachon, and that is described in the book also. They decided, and we ran into tunnels there, but we ran into what were fighting tunnels. In other words, they had abandoned or driven out the residents of a particular village called Al-Tatra. They booby-trapped, I would say, at least 50% of the houses in Al-Tatra were booby-trapped, and then they dug tunnels that connected one house to another so they could lure infantry into, because that was all airborne. We didn't want to use artillery. We didn't want to kill, civilian casualties. We were very sensitive about, civilians being killed. So they sent in light infantry without softening up the target, which is, a big no-no in the military. And we did that anyway to minimize civilian casualties. And the plan was that they would lure a platoon in to clear fire from a particular house. Then they would detonate an IED right at the doorstep, and that would split the platoon in two. So half your platoon is wounded and lying inside the house. The other half of the platoon is wounded and lying outside of the house. And they're trying to reorganize and figure out what to do. Well, then they had kidnapping teams that were in tunnels inside the house. A rug would be thrown open. The tunnel opening would be opened up. And the object was then to grab dead, dying, wounded Israeli soldiers, drag them back through the tunnels. They could be whisked out of the village inside of 5 minutes, and they would hold them for hostages and hold them for ransom and to terrorize people. Well, God was with us, and I will tell you that was a hand of God miracle, because we and I won't use the word by chance, I will tell you by divine providence, we captured one of the terrorists who had on him a map of every booby-trapped tunnel in that entire town. And so we knew where every single one of them was. Not one soldier was kidnapped, not one booby trap took one life of one Israeli. We knew where every wire was. We knew where everything was. And I don't believe that was accidental. But then somebody in a Hamas in 2009, after they lost that war, said, look, we lost the war, but those tunnels were a good idea, but let's take the idea even further. Instead of using them as a defensive weapon, once we've lured Israeli forces into our battlefield, why don't we use them as an offensive weapon, and we'll dig the tunnels literally underneath the border of Israel, and they will come up inside of kindergartens. You can imagine the mind that is behind something like that. Or they'll come up inside a dining hall where 800 people were going to be eating. Or they'll come up next to a primary school. Or they'll come up next to an old folks' home. All these tunnels, they had a network of 40 terrorist attack tunnels came up, almost all of them, without exception, in civilian little suburban neighborhoods. So if you picture your own little suburban area where you live, most of these were agricultural villages, and these are none of them settlements, and they are none of them in the West Bank. They're all in the 1948 internationally recognized border of Israel. We thought we had a ceasefire coming after the first week of aerial bombardment. We thought that was going to be the end of the war. They had started the war by kidnapping 3 Israeli schoolboys and shooting them in the back of the head. And Israel has a soft spot, and it's children. If you harm Israeli children, we will unleash hell on you. We will just unleash absolute hell on you. And they did that to suck us into that war. Well, Bibi Netanyahu was a pretty smart guy. He didn't fall for the bait. Instead of invading Gaza, he went after Hamas in the West Bank, which is where it happened, rounded out 400 of their leaders, arrested them all, and put them out of business in the West Bank. Then they began launching rockets and mortars at our communities in southern Israel, and they actually hit central Israel. They hit Tel Aviv, they hit Jerusalem. By the way, they don't care about hitting holy places. It doesn't matter to them. If they hit a mosque, that's no big deal to them. If we hit a mosque, that's a war crime.
Oh, yeah.
After 8 days, we thought we had a ceasefire. John Kerry came over and said, well, the Qatar and Turkey have assured us that Hamas has said yes to the ceasefire. So we were all getting ready to turn our equipment back in. You can ask any soldier there. They thought, well, that's it. This is a replay of 2012, which was about 8 days long. That's what this will be. And, people are getting ready to return their gear and get back to living a normal life. And that morning, they launched their first terrorist tunnel attack. And it was the most frightening thing I've seen in 40 years as a soldier. It was almost like a scene out of the Night of the Living Dead. If you can imagine your front yard, all of a sudden a hole opens up in your front yard like a grave opening up. And instead of a zombie coming up out of a grave, 13 terrorists come up out of a tunnel that stretched for a couple miles from inside of Gaza, each one of them with 2 RPGs on their back, AK-47s, tons of grenades, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and most frightening of all, they had tranquilizer shots and plastic handcuffs, which they intended to use to knock out civilian women and children. That was the main target. Drag them back through the tunnels into Gaza and hold them in underground cells. And again, we can talk about it later, but there were a couple divine miracles reported on that one. And we were spared, again, thanks to the providence of a gracious and compassionate Creator, and also to the skill and bravery and self-sacrifice of the men and women of the Israel Defense Forces, many of whom gave their lives to take these rats out. So they didn't succeed in any one of the terrorist attack tunnel attacks that they launched. We foiled every single one of them. However, ISIS had a presence in Gaza that whole time. And ISIS was watching very, very, very carefully everything that Hamas was doing. And ISIS was going, you know what, that's a doggone good idea. And just 5 days ago, I think, you can probably Google it on the internet, the Kurds found that ISIS had used a tunnel, Tel Abyad, on the Turkish border, where they have, if you look at the Middle East, what the present administration of our country does not understand is that for ISIS, the Middle East is the R&D lab for what they intend to do to us in the United States. That's their research and development center. It's not where their battle is. They have anointed themselves the caliphate, which means they are anointed by Allah and by the Prophet Muhammad. Now, you cannot be anointed by Allah and the Prophet Muhammad unless you strike at the great Satan. The Iraqis are not the great Satan. Syria is not the great Satan. America is the great Satan. They refer to us, by the way, as the soldiers of Rome. Their mentality is still in the Crusades. That's how they refer to America. We're called the soldiers of Rome. They have said, we will fly the black flag of ISIS over the Vatican. They don't mean that as hyperbole or a metaphor. They mean we will fly the black flag of ISIS over the Vatican. And then they said, Obama, we're coming for you, and we will fly the black flag of ISIS over the White House. That's exactly what they mean. That's not hyperbole. That is the goal. And they have a method of carrying it out. And as I did the research on the book, I began to realize that the country that was really vulnerable to that kind of a tactic wasn't Israel, because Israel has 24-hour-a-day observation of the whole border of Gaza. We've got balloons up there with wide-lens cameras. We've got drones constantly flying. We've got spotter aircraft. We've got boots on the ground. We have observation cameras, and we have observation posts that are manned by all-girl units, because girls have more powers of concentration than boys do, and so there are no boys allowed in the unit. That's true.
I read that in your book. I mean, you made that very clear, and it was so interesting. And I thought, he knows what he's talking about. That's not not fiction. That's faction.
Yeah. They'll just flat out say boys think about sex too much, and so these are all girl units. We also are the only unit, or the only army in the world, I believe, that uses people who have Asperger's syndrome, which is part of autism, to study aerial photography and to do observation, because their eye for detail and their obsessiveness with finding detail is greater than that of normal people. And so, thank goodness, those wonderful units spotted these bad guys. We have our most elite troops on the border 24 hours a day, ready to respond in an instant. And so we were able to deal with these attacks, sometimes at a cost of human life, but we pay that cost. We're all soldiers. We all know what we signed up for. You compare that to the United States border, that's a whole different can of beans.
Oh, my.
We don't have the kind of observation units that Israel has. We don't have the Givati Brigade of the Israel Defense Forces stationed along, or the Golani Brigade, or airborne, stationed along our border with Mexico. We've got a denuded Border Patrol and San Diego PD. And with all due respect to San Diego PD, they're no match for ISIS. And ISIS does not have to dig a single tunnel beneath the border of Mexico to strike at the United States. Those tunnels already exist. They are drug smuggling tunnels that are operated by Mexican cartels. They don't have to dig one. They just have to rent it. And ISIS has several $billion. That's a language that the cartels understand really well. We know for a fact, beyond any doubt, that numbers of terrorist organizations have already formed very, very close contacts with drug cartels in Central and South America. There's absolutely no reason to assume that ISIS will not have formed such contacts with drug cartels in Mexico. There are parts of northern Mexico that the Mexican government doesn't control, that are only controlled by the cartel. They don't need to smuggle weapons in because the cartels have the weapons. They can just rent the weapons from them or buy them from them. So if you can imagine infiltrating 10 at a time on different flights from all over Europe, 1,000 hardcore ISIS fighters into Central and South America, and then taking a month or 6 weeks to slowly infiltrate them from Central and South America up to the Mexican border with the United States, hide them in safe houses. In my book, the book is called Day of the Dead because there's a holiday in November called Dia de los Muertos, where they have a big parade in Tijuana. Everybody dresses up like a skeleton. It's sort of like Mardi Gras, and I chose that as the day that they choose to dress up like skeletons themselves so people won't recognize, their military garb, and that's the day that they're going to infiltrate into the tunnels. But the notion that you could penetrate 1,000 ISIS fighters into downtown San Diego, and we already have seen tunnels come up in San Diego, inside industrial warehouses where people are used to seeing trucks go in and out all day long, so that's not a big deal. If you think of what 3 terrorists did in Paris with the Charlie Hebdo attack, and you multiply that by 1,000 terrorists, and then you start to realize what are the targets that ISIS has. And someone said, aren't you afraid that you're giving ISIS a blueprint? And I said, no, ma'am, I'm not. What I'm afraid is I have read ISIS's blueprint. I haven't given them anything. The targets they have there are too juicy to ignore. You have half the Pacific Fleet at anchor in San Diego. You have one half the Naval Special Warfare Forces, or our Navy SEALs, are divided. The even-numbered teams are on one side of the United States. The odd-numbered teams are on the other side of the United States. So one half of our Navy SEAL forces are at Coronado Island. This administration's policy is that no U.S. military personnel can carry a weapon on a U.S. base. So you take out 20 rent-a-cops, which is why a fat psychiatrist named Major Nidal was able to kill 13 people with 2 handguns and wound 30 more at Fort Hood, Texas, because those skilled soldiers without their weapons are not soldiers, they're victims. You take a weapon away from a soldier, he is no longer a soldier, he is a victim. And so you take out 20 rent-a-cops, you own Coronado Island. You take out Shore Patrol, you can sink the Pacific Fleet. And then think of any sports arena where you've got 18,000 people watching a basketball game, and give me 200 guys with RPGs, grenades, and machine guns, and watch what I can do. And I'm not that good.
That'd be thousands dead.
Yes, yeah. You would dwarf Pearl Harbor and 9/11 combined. And then add to that the notion that you could drag hostages back through those tunnels into Mexico and execute them on YouTube, because that's their mentality.
That is a nightmare.
There's nobody who can tell me, no one on the face of the earth can tell me that this administration would invade northern Mexico to prevent U.S. loss of life. It is not going to happen, not in our lifetime.
Wow. I was thinking, as you was describing that, I was thinking that's just another setting Pearl Harbor waiting to happen. And we wasn't too alert and aware of the first Pearl Harbor, in Hawaii. But we're certainly not aware, of the danger of this one. That's what's so interesting. You was talking about the southern border, or the Mexican border with the U.S. Actually, the administration, this point in time is, everybody's to look the other way. We don't have any spotters. Not supposed to be looking that direction.
That's right. You can get in trouble for it. Talk to the guys who are in the Border Patrol Officers Union. They'll tell you about it all the time. I live in Arizona. I've been down patrolling that border with folks, and have gone out on patrols, drive-alongs with the Border Patrol. It's about as porous as the day is long. We know that there are tunnels that come up not just in California, they come up in Arizona, they come up in Texas. If I really wanted to, tell you how they were going to do it, it's not hard. If you look at what ISIS did when they took Ramadi about 10 days ago, I guess it was 10 days or 2 weeks ago, they took half a dozen American MRAPs, which are the heaviest armored vehicles that the U.S. has, and they turned those into ammonium nitrate and diesel fuel bombs, the same kind of truck bomb that McVeigh used on the Oklahoma City federal building, the same kind of truck bomb that took out the Marine barracks in Beirut, same kind of truck bomb that took out the Khobar Towers barracks in Saudi Arabia. It's a very well-known Middle Eastern terrorist bomb. So what they did in Ramadi was they set off 6 of these truck bombs at the same time. So if I was commanding that operation and my target was either San Diego or L.A., and L.A. is just as vulnerable, it's a 2-hour truck drive and you can transport your troops up there very easily, I would start by setting off a half a dozen to a dozen of these truck bombs, each one of which is going to kill 200 to 300 people. Then I've got a decision to make. Do I want to have secondary bombs go off to take out the first responders when they show up to take care of the victims, or do I want to send my forces in the exact opposite side of town while they're occupied on the other side of town with the first victims? But those are my choices. So I'd started off quite literally with a bang. I'd set off 6 to a dozen of these truck bombs that would create total chaos in an urban setting, and then I'd strike with my infantry. And to think that they can penetrate 500 to 1,000 guys through those drug tunnels, that's a piece of cake. That's a walk in the park for them. And then you would have an attack that would dwarf both Pearl Harbor and 9/11 combined. And I must tell you, without exaggeration, I'm not saying this to sell books. I wrote a book to sound a warning. I guarantee you that there are ISIS staff officers right now, and you cannot have contempt for them like this administration does. You cannot sit there and say they're the JV wannabes in Kobe Bryant jerseys. You have to have respect for your enemy if you want to defeat him. I guarantee you there are ISIS staff officers right now being presented actionable intelligence and plans of this type right now, and they are trying to figure out which is the one we're going to do, because a good terrorist operation is going to take you about a year to set up. You're going to send in advanced teams that are going to study the targets. They're going to pick out what targets there are. How do you ingress and egress troops? What's the response time of first responders? What's the attitude of the local government? What are the traffic patterns that can screw you up? What's the best time of year in which to do it? All those variables take people on the ground making careful notes for months and months and months and months. And then as your D-Day approaches, you begin refining that plan and refining it and refining it. So I think we are probably where Al-Qaeda was in 1999. I'm hoping that we have at least a year, but we don't have more than that. And I can guarantee you that.
I'll tell you what, that's heavy, but I do pray, hope and pray that people read your book and that it does some awakening. If nothing else among the people, because the force you're talking, they've made movies like Red Dawn and then Red Dawn's remake, and those are all fine and good, but you're talking about people that's going to come through there that's going to cause more destruction and catastrophe in the infrastructure and the people of this country than those shows ever portrayed. I mean, you're talking about people that are coming to kill thousands and thousands, and there is no mercy. I mean, they don't know mercy.
No, and you cannot say, well, we've set up an effective deterrence against them because they know if they try it, they'll be killed or captured. Because for ISIS, death is not a deterrence, it's an incentive. They will tell you our highest aspiration is to die for Allah. So if you're promising me that I'm going to die in combat, I'm coming today. That's the best news I've ever heard.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I was in law enforcement 30-something years, and I was in the Air Force and I was in SAC and also the Army. And, you know, the most dangerous person in the world is someone that don't care whether they live or die. If they don't care, if they are not afraid to die, if they're there to die, that's a very dangerous person in front of you. I mean, that's just something you don't take lightly. And like you said, here in America, we're so big right now, especially the administration is so big on making lightly of all of this. I mean, all of it. They, you know, even the people that are still trying to warn that from our own government, some of our own whistleblowers are just being mocked, literally mocked. But the trouble is, when it does come true, it will be true, and there won't be a thing they can do because it will have happened. You know, from your book, you know, Day of the Dead, Book 1, Gaza, there's two things that struck me really heavy. Now, I don't know if you meant to portray this, but it really struck me. Number one, you know, and I read how that the operation began and ended, you know, basically at the time in Israel, and then, of course, the Israelis, you know, warned the Americans, you know, of a threat. But the interesting thing was about your entire book was, number one, if you saw it from the eyes of what you were writing from seeing, Israel is just absolutely a literal miracle just to be there, period.
You bet.
An absolute miracle, you know, to even still exist. And then on the other hand, it's a miracle America's still alive. I mean, you know, because the warning you're warning is just, it's so timely, Dan. It is so timely.
I'll show you the difference. When we had the first terrorist tunnel attack against Israel, which we foiled, and we killed half the terrorist force that came out, and we incinerated them pretty good with a Hellfire missile fired from a drone, and the rest of them tried to escape back into Gaza. We don't know how many got back into Gaza or not because we blew that tunnel up, so they didn't get to use that one again. But the minute that happened, that night we invaded Gaza. And we invaded Gaza with one clear objective. It wasn't to conquer Gaza, which we could do. It wasn't to depose Hamas and topple the Hamas government, which we could do. It wasn't to inflict mass casualties on the Palestinian people, which we could do. It was very, very specifically to find the tunnels, find the entrances, find the exits, and neutralize them, blow them up so they could not be used against our people. So we went in that night. We went in hard. We went in heavy, and it's exactly what we did in about a 40-day campaign. We found, I would venture to say, 95% of the tunnels. There's probably 5% we didn't find, and we blew them up. We neutralized them. They're at work rehabilitating them. We know that we're not finished with Hamas. We know that this isn't the war to end all wars. We've bought ourselves time, which is what all of our wars only do, because our neighbors are bent on destroying us. But that's the difference. We went in, we invaded, we neutralized the tunnels. If that same thing happened in San Diego, is there anybody who can make any case that anyone on the face of the earth would believe that this administration would invade northern Mexico in order to neutralize the tunnels? In no possible way. And we'd write a very stern letter to the Mexican government and say, now we expect you to deal with this problem. And, of course, the Mexican government doesn't control most of the parts of northern Mexico. So what you would then have is the same kind of situation that the Viet Cong enjoyed Vietnam, having safe havens across the border from which they could operate. It won't just be one attack, Larry. It will be the beginning of a sustained effort. They're not in it to do one headline-grabbing attack. They are in it to say, okay, now we've brought the war to the great Satan, and we will begin literally guerrilla warfare inside the United States. And Americans don't understand what it is to live this way. Having lived in Israel for, I was raised there, I was married there, 2 of my 3 children were born there. I mean, I lived there a long time. You can get used to living with terrorism. You can almost think of it like traffic jams. I remember my oldest boy, of blessed memory, was in preschool, and he was in Jerusalem, in a place called near Machane Yehuda, which was a great outdoor market. And the terrorists would start setting off bombs on Friday, which was the day that the Sabbath begins, around noon. And they would do it every week, and we knew it. And so I, as a matter of course, would go and pick my son up early from preschool at around 11, almost the way you would think, okay, that's how we'll beat a traffic jam, because I know that, rush hour starts at 3. So the bombs are going to start going off around 12. I'll pick them up early at around 11. Israelis are very tough people. We learned to live that way, and we lived that way in 1,000. And if you go into the Second Intifada, 1,000 Israelis were killed in the Second Intifada. Tens of thousands were wounded and their lives really destroyed. It didn't break us as a people. Think of what one sniper did in the back of a trunk, shutting down all of Washington, D.C. and Maryland.
I remember.
We have no idea what it is to live that way. We're about to find out, and we're not preparing for it. And like I said, the book is meant to be a wake-up call. We should have, all along the border, ready response units of federal troops who are locked and loaded 24 hours a day, ready to move out within 10 minutes' notice of the President of the United States to respond to a terrorist attack. We don't have it. It's going to. You're
exactly right, Dan. And the sad thing is, we are simply not prepared, and we're not getting prepared. Not to meet what you're talking about. Not to meet a force that's going to come rushing in to do all the damage they can do. And I like I said, I've been in police work for years. I'm not now, I'm retired, but the police won't stop them. I mean, you can dial 911 all day, but that's not going to stop these guys,
Well, if you want to, the clearest example, if you want to look on YouTube, there's that YouTube video of the two terrorists in Paris, and a cop car comes charging down the road towards them, and all of a sudden the cops realize they're in a, Peugeot cop car, and they're facing two guys with RPGs. Now, if you've never seen what an RPG can do, I can guarantee you Peugeot's no match for it. And the cops took off. The cops took off running, and the terrorists continued killing. And that's just the way it's going to be. And we just, if the terrorists look at the Middle East as their R&D facility, we should be doing the same thing. We should look at what Israel experienced and say, okay, what if that happened to us? How would we respond? And get ready for it now. Instead, we're doing nothing except supporting the UN having war crimes investigations against Israel for our supposed war crimes during the war in Gaza, which is insanity. You've got an American female judge, and I have nothing against American female judges. Like you said, I was interviewed by Judge Jeanine Pirot, and I'd partner up with her in a foxhole any day of the week. She's
you bet.
She's got a brass pair, and she is as bright and tough as they come. But here was a woman who heads up the committee, who has no military experience, has never been in the military in her life, has never been in a war in her life, and no one on her committee has any such experience, and they're going to judge what soldiers do on the battlefield. It's absolute insanity. But that's the only thing the United States is doing in response to what happened in Israel a year ago, instead of learning the lessons from it. And I talk to my American military counterparts all the time. I mean, I have really good friends in the American military. Mm-hmm. One of them is a retired 4-star Marine Corps general. And I said, I won't tell you the guy's name. Actually, I will. He gave me a blurb on the book, so it doesn't matter. His name is Bob Magnus. I said, Bob, let me ask you something. I said, I don't want to make a fool out of myself. Am I describing something that's so far-fetched that a professional like yourself would say, this Gordon guy, he knows how to string words together, but the guy is just an idiot. None of this stuff is real. He's just spinning his wheels. I said, am I going to make a fool out of myself with this thing? And he said, all I can tell you is that all the connections that you've made in your scenario exist as of today.
Wow.
So you sit there and say, well, he knows that. He's not the only smart guy in the military. I'm sure that our military is giving the best advice humanly possible to our political echelon, which has got its head firmly planted up, like I say, an orifice where the sun never shines.
That's right.
And that's, if you have contempt for your enemy, if you refuse to recognize your enemy, if you can't even call your enemy by their name, which is Islamist terror, don't think that you're going to be able to defeat them. You're not even in the same game.
That's exactly right. He's going to eat your lunch. I mean, it's simple.
Yeah. You're not even in the same game with him. You're not even on the same playing field.
Wow. Well, listen, Dan, we're at the top of the hour. We're going to take, just hang on with us. We're going to take just a few minutes here of some music so you can get you a sip of water or whatever you need, and we'll be back right after this play. Wow, that was good. Dan, you still there?
I sure am. What an apt song, as if in the days of Noah. That is exactly where we're at.
Oh, my God. What a time we live in. Hey, Richard, you here now?
I am. Hello, can you hear me?
Hey.
Hey, Richard, my good friend. How are you?
Hey, Dan. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. I miss you, and I will see you soon. I'm going to be in L.A. this coming week, so we'll get together.
Oh, and I would very much look forward to that. I guess I'm going to be meeting Shlomi pretty soon here, too.
Yeah, I guess he's coming in, yeah.
I was
I'll tell you what,
with great interest
Richard,
to all you were saying, Dan, about your new book. Fantastic, and I'm excited that it's finally out. And Dan is one of the smartest people I know, so I mean this is a great thing.
Thank you.
I'll tell you what, I wanted to mention one other thing before I get you guys to talking, Dan, and that is I just wanted to bring up for people that like a little bit of the very interesting, I guess you'd say, spiritual side. You wrote a book. It's a book called Postcards from Heaven, Messages of Love from the Other Side by Dan Gordon. And I got my hands on that because I thought, well, that sounds interesting. And I'll tell you what, the situation with the spacesuit is so unique. Tell us about that, if you would. The spacesuit, and I read about your brother, and that was the part where I just, almost just cried. I mean, but on the other hand, it was so incredibly funny at the same time with some of the data you put in it. But tell us about the spacesuit and how this book actually came about at all.
Well, I've worked from back to front. It came about after my son, Zachy, of blessed memory, was killed at the age of 22 in a car accident. And he was my firstborn son. He was the only of my three sons who was going into my profession. He was immensely talented screenwriter, wonderful director, absolute genius. He had gone to Columbia University, then he went to NYU Tisch School of the Arts, which is regarded by some as the best film school in the world. He graduated summa cum laude at the top of his class. He had sold his first television script when he was 12 years of age. He had become a published author in hardback at 19 years of age, and at 20 he produced and directed and wrote his first full-length feature film. So he was blessed literally with everything but the gift of years. Extraordinary young man. And unfortunately, no one has to give me lessons in what it is to grieve for the loss of a child. I've been there, done that, and I will tell you unashamedly, were it not for the fact that I had 2 other sons and could not do that to them, I would have blown my brains out the first week without any doubt. My faith wasn't strong enough to pull me through.
Wow.
And I actually put a passage in the book, which is into the mouth of one of the characters in the book, which is true about myself. To this day, there's not a day that goes by when I don't have an argument with myself about why I should not join my son. And I lose that argument every day today because of my faith. And I keep saying, I look forward to the one day where I won't lose the argument. That's not really true. That was just for the purposes of the book. But honestly, I couldn't lay that burden on my children of having a brother killed in front of them. They were in the car with him when it happened, and then having a father commit suicide, which I was longing to do. The pain was just unbelievable, and I wanted it to be over. And at a given point in time, I had that moment where people of faith have, and I've been gifted with faith my whole life. But it was at that moment where I literally said, God, this burden is too heavy for me. It's going to crush me, and I can't carry it. And so I'm just going to lay it down at your feet, and you decide what to do with it, because it will crush me. And if it's your will that it crush me, then it will crush me. And if it's your will that it won't crush me, you'll pick it up. But I sure as heck can't carry it. Wow. And as I did that, I began to get what I described in the book as postcards. And that's all they were. They weren't like great revelations, great letters. They were little messages saying, got here safe. It's really beautiful. Much love till we meet again. And they were numerous and constant. And whenever I have needed one in my life, and there have been numbers of times, and some during this last war, I will tell you, in a couple, just within the last couple weeks, I had to reach out to my son, to my brother, to my Creator, and say, I need a sign that you're with me, because you give me the sign and I won't break. That's the deal I'll cut with you. You give me the sign that you're still with me. I know you're there. I will not break. And as I talked to people about this, I finally got the courage to begin talking to people, and I never met one person who didn't have a story about a what I call postcard from heaven. Whether it's I know one woman was telling me that she was in great despair, and she was close to suicide, and the radio was on, and she was ready to do the deed. And a song came on, a rock and roll station that was written in the 1920s. And it was the disc jockey said, I don't even know why I'm playing this song. Wow. Because it's just, I heard it the other day and it knocked me out, and I'm just going to play it because I feel like it. Well, it was her father's favorite song, and it was the one he sang for her. And she said when she needed to hear his voice saying, don't do this, it's not your time, it's not your life to take away, it's God's life. And when God decides to reclaim it, that's when it'll go. That's when she heard it. And so I began sort of collecting these stories from other people and became open and aware of them in my own life. And some of them are the most miraculous stories you can imagine. And I'll just tell you one.
Okay, hold on. Just before you do, my producer's asking Richard to mute his computer, please. Richard, can you mute your computer?
No sound in the room with me, but I can mute. I'm just on my phone.
Oh, he's just on his phone. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not on the computer. I'm downstairs away from the computer on my phone.
getting feedback from somewhere. I don't hear it, but they say they are. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm on a phone too, so I don't know where that's coming from. Could be a postcard. You never know. So,
wow. That's a good.
I don't know if you guys know this. I need to interject one short comment here, if I could.
Sure.
A few years ago, I was working with another guy who was a partner with me on a project, and we were asked to create a pilot show called Postcards from Heaven. Now, this was in 1999, so it was probably before you wrote your book, Dan. And one of the stories, it was a real story that had to do with, and we actually used the crew from Touched by an Angel to work with us on it.
Huh.
And one of the stories was a soldier that had been traveling at night with his wife on Iceland, and he was driving in the fog late at night, and, you know, there's a lot of cliffs and mountains and really cool geography there. I've been to Iceland a couple times. And anyway, he was driving up on where they call Bird Rock, which is a sheer cliff at the top of that whole area. And it's real foggy. He's in like an old Dodge or some old American car, and suddenly he felt like there was someone pushing down really hard on his shoulder. And it startled him, so he stopped the car, and he thought, maybe I should get out and see what's going on here. So he gets out, and he realized that his car was only a couple feet from the edge of a precipice.
Okay.
And if he'd continued to have driven, he would have driven right off the edge of the cliff. But it was so foggy, and the thing had a big hood, and he was headed uphill, so he couldn't see it.
Wow.
Really wild. There are these strange synchronous events that occur. I mean, I felt kind of that Dan and I were brought together for the Torah-Codes film under strange synchronous events as well, and I've always been grateful for that.
Well, you guys share a little bit of that with us. I told Dan that I had some photographs that you had taken, you know, in Israel when y'all were over there together, and that is really interesting how that all came together.
Well, we'd been talking about wanting to do this film for a long time, and the money just never came for it. And finally, a man just wanted to see me get the film done. I had done 8 documentaries, so at that point I had a proven track record that I could turn out a documentary. So the film finally got funded, and Dan was just fantastic, and we killed his schedule. It was brutal. His getting ready.
Yeah.
He was in Israel for a while, and then he came home for just a short time, and then he's back in Israel again. So he didn't know if it was day or night or what day of the week it was or anything else.
Yeah.
But he really hooked us up with some really fantastic people, and I wouldn't have had some of the great interviews I had it not been for Dan. So my hat's off to you, Dan.
Yeah, I was privileged to work as their military liaison officer on that film, and for those people who haven't seen it, I encourage you to get copies of the Torah Codes. It is one of the really great documentaries and important documentaries of our time, and I guarantee you it will be a life changer. It was a total and complete privilege to work with you on that, and as I've told you in private many times, I think you're doing some of the most important work in the world right now with the Torah Codes and what you're doing.
Well, it's hard for me to kind of pull that in because that's a big thing to say, but I really appreciate it. Thank you, Dan. I just looked on Amazon and discovered that we're up to number 18 on special interest in the Blu-ray category, which not too bad.
Congratulations, that's fantastic. Well, hopefully this show will push you up to 17, 16.
Well, it changes every hour, so it could be next hour we could be at number 56. But we've been under 100 now for quite a while, so I mean,
that's spectacular.
There's a lot of films out there, so I'm grateful for that.
Yep, that is spectacular. And we have both been witness to those synchronicity moments that we were talking about. One of the places that that I took Richard and the crew to was a place that was a very famous story during last summer's war. And it was one of those hand of God miracles, and it had to do with the terrorist tunnels. And as I said in the film, the military never investigated the story because it had no military connection to it. So I can't vouch for it as an Israeli officer because we honestly never investigated it. It just wasn't of interest to the military. But it was very, very, very widely reported in the Israeli press. And I've run into numbers of people who said, "Yep, that's a true one." The coming year, for those who know their Bible, is a sabbatical year for the earth. You know, the biblical requirements for agriculture are that you give the earth a Sabbath every seventh year. You don't farm; the land lies fallow. And this coming year is that sabbatical year for the earth. Well, you know, Jews make matzah out of unleavened wheat. But if there's going to be a sabbatical year, the year ahead, then the guys who make this very special kosher matzah have to get green wheat before it's harvested because they have to store it for a year because there's not going to be any wheat the next year. And so the story goes that there were a group of very religious Jews from a town called Bnei Brak who had a small factory to make matzah, and they were looking high and low all over Israel for a field of tall green wheat that they could harvest early. You know, the wheat harvest is usually around September, late August, September.
And Dan took me actually to one of those fields that, it's not the actual field, one that's very similar to what he's describing right now, Larry.
Yeah, that's the one in the book, wasn't it? In the book.
Yeah, and so they were after, you know, a wheat field just so that they would have this, you know, wheat for the matzah for the year ahead. And they cut a deal with the kibbutz, and the kibbutz said, okay, yeah, you can harvest it early. And they harvested that entire wheat field. Well, 2 days later, that was the wheat field where the terrorist tunnel opened up. And that wheat was supposed to be the camouflage that would have enabled the terrorists to get to the children's house of that little agricultural village. And you can see on YouTube, you literally can see the footage where they pop up out of the tunnel, they ninja roll, and they look around, and you can see they're in shock, like, what happened to the wheat field, man? That was our camouflage. And you can choose to say, well, that's just an interesting coincidence that Jews who were following biblical injunctions about how to farm the land just happened to pick that particular wheat field, or you can see in that the hand of a compassionate and almighty protector. And that's a choice you can make.
And it just so happens that the IDF posted the actual footage of it, too, happening.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, so you actually can go on YouTube and see these guys, and they are in shock. And the minute they pop out, they realize their goose is cooked, and they start running back towards the tunnel because they know there are observation units that have probably spotted them already. And sure enough, inside of 30 seconds, there was, you know, quite literally hellfire raining down on them.
That's actually that whole story and everything about it's in the Torah Code film if someone's interested in seeing all of that.
Yeah, and you will see exactly that incident, you know, the recreation of it, and Richard in the field. We couldn't get to the exact field where it happened because that literally is right on the border, and that area is closed off unless you're, you know, a member of that agricultural community and you're actually working in the field. But you see exactly, you know, where it happened and how it happened, and you see the observation balloon that had the cameras in there that spotted these guys, and the Torah Code film will give you that full story.
Well, it's interesting. The civilians in that area are like riding by on bicycles, and slung over their shoulders are machine guns normally, and no one thinks anything of it. That's just life there.
Yeah. And
it's so interesting. It's so interesting, Dan, how that that life there, and I've got so many pictures or photographs out of Israel where you've got teachers at schools standing with the children with a weapon on. You've got everybody's. You don't pull a terrorist attack in Israel without getting hurt hardly, and in America it is so lax, and America's so proud of gun-free zones, and I'm thinking that's backwards.
Yeah. Well, any terrorist who attacks in a public place in Israel knows that within a few seconds, a well-trained Israeli with a weapon is going to kill him. While it may not deter that particular terrorist who may want to be a shaheed, a martyr, and go claim his 72 virgins in heaven, I can guarantee you he sure as heck isn't going to hurt anybody else again in his life. And he will not have a lawyer who will get him off on a technicality.
That's right.
I remember when I was, again, I'm going back now, when I was a young kid. I was in my early 30s. It was in, late 70s, and it was the height of the infiltration terrorist attacks from Lebanon into northern Israel. And there was a terrible, you can't imagine the mindset of these people. They ambushed a group of 30 school children who were on a field trip, and they executed them, got them down on their knees, put guns up to their heads, and blew their brains out, and killed something like 15 kids before the army was able to get in there and kill them. And after that, every school and every community up in the north of Israel, before the kids would come into school, we had a volunteer system because there weren't enough cops to do it and there wasn't enough army to do it. So the Israeli citizenry volunteered. On top of your job, you would volunteer to guard in a community. And I remember spending weeks up there where I would sleep next to the kindergartens because you wanted to make sure nobody got in there during the night and was waiting for the kids to get in there. I'd be pulling a shift, and then I'd sleep, and then the other guy who was on guard would, pull his shift, and, he'd be asleep. And before we ever let the kids go into any of the schools, we would go in with automatic weapons and sweep every classroom. And that's just the way we lived. We were not going to let that kind of barbarity put a dent in our days. With all the grief, with all the pain, we continued to live, we continued to flourish, and we created, with the help of God, and I will tell you, no people but without God could have done it, but literally with the Lord's help, one of the most exciting, flourishing, magnificent countries on the face of the earth. We are the startup nation, and outside of Silicon Valley, we are the biggest R&D center in the entire world. We're the tiniest piece of real estate, and yet the blessings that we've brought to the world in terms of scientific advances in medicine. You know that the cell phone that I'm speaking to you on right now was invented in Israel, as was every cell phone that is used in the world. That's where it was invented. The Pentium chip that's in your computer was invented in Israel. Voicemail was invented in Israel. Most of the drugs today that are used for cancer patients were invented in Israel. Nanotechnology, which is going to be the wave of the future in medicine, that's where it's all happening in Israel. So despite never having one day of peace in 67 years of existence, we've built this beautiful, flourishing country that literally is a blessing to the earth. And if you look at our neighbors, what blessing have they brought to the earth? The suicide bomber and burning people alive and truck bombs.
Good point.
Beheading people, and drowning people, and torturing people.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is what just tears me apart so many times is hearing the rest of the world. I never hear one argument about a Gaza rocket going over into southern Israel or into Israel, but I always hear all the complaints about Israel firing back. It's so crazy.
Yeah, we have a right to defend ourselves.
I was just going to say, when Dan introduced me to Colonel Danny Grossman, we had this ability to go in and visit some of these people that had been essentially near a war zone where their kibbutz was being attacked by Hamas rockets on a daily basis, and what's that like, and how do they get away from that? And that's one reason I put it in the film. It really didn't have all that much to do about the Torah codes, but it did have to do a lot about what's really going on in Israel and what these people literally have to put up with. It's not that they're causing the problem. They're peaceful, normal people like you'd find living in Malibu or someplace like that. It's just not what you think it is. So, people are unaware of that situation and how the children have to be aware that they could get blown up by a rocket and they have to take cover, and they see these things happening and they hear it, and it's traumatizing for them.
Listen, there is a village and it's a one-of-a-kind village. It's an extraordinary, one of the most extraordinary places on the face of the earth. It's called Alea Negev, and it's a village for special needs children and adults. In other words, people who are impaired mentally, who have either are on the autism spectrum, or who have traumatic brain injury, or who are stroke victims, people who are facing mental challenges, be they children or adults. And it's an absolutely gorgeous village, rehabilitative hospital, state-of-the-art. It was founded by an Israeli general at the height of his career, who was about to be named chief of staff, resigned from the army in order to found this village. He was the guy who was the toughest commando in the Israeli army. He was the first commando off the plane in Entebbe. He's become a dear, dear friend of mine. And at the height of his career, this military man, this supposed, and he's actually wanted as a war criminal in England. This guy, who was close to a holy man, founded this village for special needs individuals. At least half of the people who are at the village are Muslim Arabs. He said, look, mental disease, impairments, mental challenges don't discriminate between Jews and Muslims. We're not going to discriminate between Jews and Muslims. If you're here, we love you. If you're here, I love you as if you were one of my own children. I'll tuck you into bed. I'll kiss you goodnight. And he literally does visit every patient every day, tuck them into bed, knows their families, knows their stories, and no one pays a dime there. This wonderful village was targeted by Hamas with their rockets, and nobody said boo about it. And it's the most helpless people on earth. The mentally impaired are the ones that they targeted. And you sit there and say, how can you call yourself a civilized society and not censor that type of behavior? And yet the people being investigated for war crimes are Israelis. It's insane.
Yeah, it's
absolutely. I got to see the place for myself. It's an incredible facility, and it's nothing but peace and helping other people. That's all it's about.
Wasn't that location in your book you talked about, I believe, Dan, same general, didn't he go into Africa and save a bunch of people there that were about to be killed?
He sure did. He's one of the few people in the book who I don't use a made-up name. His name is Doron Almog. He's a major general in the reserves, and I give the address where people can contribute to the rehabilitative village that he built because his son was a special needs kid, and his son, like my son, died at 22. We have that sort of horrible bond. But his response to it was not despair. His response to it was to create a place of hope. And it really is. I've never seen a village more full of love in my life than that place. And the people on the other side of the border are not bad people by and large. Your heart goes out to them. Gaza is occupied, but not by Israel. It's occupied by Hamas. When I went into Gaza in 2009, because I am a gray-haired individual and an old guy in comparison to the kids around me, people usually coming up and seeing my gray hair assume I'm the senior officer in charge. Because if you're wearing a flak jacket, nobody can see what your rank is. You've got a flak jacket over it.
Right.
And so a Palestinian Arab came up to me, and in a mixture of Hebrew and English, he said, "You're the general." And I said, "Well, I'm not really the general." He said, "Don't tell me, you're the general, I know." He said, "Why don't you go in and kill them all?" And I said, "Who exactly am I supposed to kill?" He said, "Hamas." I said, "Wait a second." I said, "You're a Palestinian and you're telling me you want me to go in and kill all of Hamas?" He said, "That's right." I said, "Why?" He said, "You see this field we're standing in right now?" I said, "Yep." He said, "This was my field. I'm a farmer. I grew the best sunflower seeds in the entire Middle East. No one grew better sunflower seeds than me." He said, "And Hamas came, confiscated my farm, turned it into a rocket launching pad to send rockets against your people." He said, "How do I feed my children with rockets? I can't harvest rockets. You go in there and you kill them all." And
that
this
is
was
amazing.
a Palestinian saying that to me.
Yeah, well, Hamas is also, as we saw at the Tel Aviv Air Force Base, or forcing Palestinians to stand on the roofs of their buildings so that Israeli forces won't target the buildings because they know that missiles are inside.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Using them as human shields.
Yeah, and that's documented. That's not even, we have footage that you can see on YouTube of children gathered around a rocket launcher by Hamas so that Israel cannot hit that rocket launcher because there are a bunch of little kids around. Mm-hmm. And that's, their calculus is if they fire a rocket and kill a Jew, that's a success. If they fire a rocket and the Jews fire back and kills a Palestinian, that's an even bigger success from them. Because then they get to wear the mantle of victimhood. Then they get to say, see, we're really the poor, put upon, beset Palestinian people who the Nazi-like Israelis are slaughtering without mercy. And the world falls for it every time.
And that's the twisted mind that we're dealing with. And really, I read your book very closely. And that's one of the things that you described very clearly in your book was how that they used the population around them, the peace-loving people basically around them that just want somewhere to live, and use them all. The whole structure basically of Gaza is built, is undermined and built as Hamas wants it. It's not really the Palestinians. They don't have anything. Hamas got it all.
Yeah. And look, before Hamas took over Gaza, the relationship between the Gazan Palestinians and the Israelis was superb, was excellent. They used to come across and work in Israel. We used to go across and buy in Gaza. Our farmers traded with each other. There were tremendous friendships with between families who had known each other for 40 years. We, to people who say, "Oh, you intended Gaza to become a prison," there's a crossing in Israel called Kerem Shalom, which is called that literally that means the vineyard of peace. Mm-hmm. And we built a terminal to handle 30,000 people a day crossing into Israel back and forth. And it cost us hundreds of millions. It looks like the most modern airline terminal in the world. And It was built to be the easiest border crossing in the entire world. It's the proof that we wanted peace is there in concrete and steel. And in what people forget is in 10 years ago, in 2005, we ended the occupation. We used the Israeli army against Jewish Israelis, pulled them out of their farms, their places of worship, their businesses, uprooted them, and gave every centimeter of Gaza to the Palestine Authority in order to give peace a chance, and then built this terminal to say, we're ready to handle 30,000 people a day foot traffic going back and forth into Israel. We're expecting peace, not just hoping for it. We expect peaceful relationships. And the proof of what their intentions are is that in 2009, they began building 40 terrorist attack tunnels under our border to hit our kindergartens, to hit our civilians, to hit our agricultural communities. So there's no, this isn't theoretical. It's not my opinion versus somebody else's opinion. It's there in concrete and steel.
Mm. Well, the man who's in the Torah Code film, who we interviewed near one of the kibbutzes, Shai Hermesh, I'm sure you remember, Dan.
Sure.
Shai was a paratrooper and part of the Knesset at one time, and also had friends that were Palestinians, and one of them would do exactly what Dan's saying. Before all this happened, they were coming back and forth into Israel and making a living and going back, and some of his money was in a bank in Israel, and then he was kind of trapped on the Gaza Strip and couldn't get back in, so Shai went as a favor and pulled his money out for him and met him at the border and gave it to him. And as far as we know, that's the last money he was able to make for a number of years. I don't know what he's doing now.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is Shai Hamesh was head of one of the largest vocational and agricultural schools in southern Israel. And we armored places in those schools for Gazan students. In other words, that was part of the preparation for peace, saying, if you're a Palestinian, you live in Gaza, and you want to learn an advanced skill, you want to learn advanced agriculture, we've got a school for you. We'll treat you the same as we treat our own students. Come and enroll. We want you to succeed. We want you to have the Singapore of the Middle East, because then we'll have peace. And those students who benefited from that, many of them were tracked down and killed by Hamas.
Hmm. Wow.
Well,
let me ask you,
Dan. Can't go on forever,
yeah.
But what do you guys think of the rabbi that had this vision of seeing Eliza and said there was going to be a big war coming? And Dan, I know that you've told me you felt like that was going to happen later this year. What's your feelings about that?
Well, I think we're look. It's not that there. I'll put it a different way. It's not that there's a big war coming. We're in a big war right now. Mm-hmm. The Middle East right now is seeing the greatest upheaval that it has seen in over 1,000 years.
Well, that's the truth.
It's been 1,000 years since militant Islam, conversion by the sword, came out of the Arabian Peninsula with such virulence that it conquered territory as quickly as ISIS is conquering territory today. The Persian Empire that exists today, that has what's called the Shia Crescent, that runs from the Indian Ocean all the way to the Mediterranean, is bigger than at any time since 500 years before Christ. You have two Islamist movements that literally want to conquer the world. One is ISIS, and the other is Iran. Our administration has no plan to deal with one of them, and it's about to give a nuclear weapon to the other. So we are, if one were to say, where are we in, if you wanted to put this in World War II terms, are we in 1939 yet? No, my guess is we're in 1938. But the war has begun. And it's going to get bigger, and it's going to get nastier, and it's going to come to American shores. And it's going to come here in a way that's not going to be one attack, and all these lone wolf attacks, I promise you, are sleight of hand meant to keep our attention away from the big attack that's coming. It's the left jab that's going to take your eye off that right hook that's going to knock you out.
Good point. Dan, is that what you think Jade Helm is all about, or do you think it's something else?
I don't know. That one I can't give you an informed opinion on. I've heard so many conflicting things, and I scratch my head and say something's going on there, but I'm not wise enough to figure out what it is.
Let me ask you something, Dan. One of the things I wanted to ask you in the first hour, though, that ties in with just what we're talking about here is the Jordan connection. Because Brett Baier did a piece on Fox, this weekend he was showing it, called Crossing Jordan. And the interesting thing is we know that King Abdullah is really, appears to be really pro-Israel. And also Netanyahu has made statements that they would back Jordan or help Jordan if Jordan needed it. And we know the ISIS threat is right on Jordan's border now, and they're probably ISIS inside Jordan. What's your opinion of what's going on there?
Well, even more than that, for the people who say that Israel has to hand over the West Bank to the Palestinians, and we have to do it now, and there can't be any Israeli presence in the Jordan Valley, the truth of the matter is, and everybody knows it, and no one knows it better than King Abdullah, if we hand the West Bank to the Palestinians, ISIS will sweep Abdullah off the throne, and Jordan will become part of the caliphate. The guarantor of Jordan is not the United States. The guarantor of Jordan is the Israel Defense Forces. And Abdullah knows that extraordinarily well. Back in the day, I knew Abdullah's father, I can't say intimately well. We met on numbers of occasions over the years, and we liked each other. I'm proud to say a lot. He was as close to a holy man as I've ever met, the late King Hussein of blessed memory. He was facing a Syrian invasion the Jordanian army would not have been able to withstand. And the Israeli government issued a statement and mobilized its forces and put Syria on notice and said, if you dare to invade Jordan, we will take you out. And we are what saved Jordan. So it's not unprecedented. We are extraordinarily close to the Hashemite kingdom and its leadership. I wish that we were as close to the citizens of Jordan who have been stirred up against Israel, but King Abdullah certainly knows who his friends are, and he has no better friends than the Israelis, and he knows that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
Oh, I was just asking about Jade Helm, and I agree with Dan. There's a lot of theories about it, and we still haven't arrived at which one it is. But it seems that some of my friends think we're either preparing for war or some kind of massive planetary event that they don't want to tell us about.
That certainly is a possibility. I mean, preparations that we're seeing right now, reading some of the, matter of fact, Dan, one of my classics is the Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising. I'm sure you're familiar with that one.
You bet, sure.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder almost if some of our movements, I know there's a lot going on in the country and a lot of politics that are really, really bad. I mean, really bad. And but as much armor that's being moved and the infrastructure around the country is really at risk right now, especially from an EMP. And the whole world knows that. We're just living on it's like a thread we're living on right now.
I agree with that 100%. And it's not even an EMP. If you just think of, if someone places a very easy to build truck bomb near a transmitter that supplies electricity to an area of 50,000 people, you're going to be able to knock out the power for those 50,000 people for the 3 or 4 or 5 hours that you need to go in with a terrorist force and kill thousands of people. And then you'll leave. You won't. It's not about, we're going to take over San Jacinto. No, they're not going to take over San Jacinto, but they sure as heck might just hit a community that size and then leave and then do it again. I believe inside of 5 years, we will look like Syria. in that we will be fighting a guerrilla war within our own country. And that is a terrifying prospect to me. And you've got enough disaffected psychos in this country who see the ISIS recruiting films and the beheadings and go, wow, I can cut people's heads off, burn them alive, drown them like rats, defile 12-year-old girls, and God will bless me for that, and I get to wear a cool black suit and I get a knife too. I'm joining up. And all it takes is a few thousand of those type of people to join together with terrorists that you can infiltrate to put a real dent in our party. And I fear that's really that's
and twisted, but that's really what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. You know?
Yeah, one of the go ahead.
Well, I think people just aren't aware. It's not that it's going to be like Al-Qaeda, an attack. They intend to wage guerrilla warfare in this country, and they will.
Yeah.
And they'll be operating out of safe havens in northern Mexico, and we are not going to invade northern Mexico to take them out.
And one of the interesting things in this scenario, too, is the fact, and Dan and Richard, you both know well, it wouldn't take much stirring up in this country to really negate our being able to assist Israel at all in some kind of attack that comes upon them.
Mm-hmm. Very true.
Yeah,
Very
it seems
true.
like Obama would just stand down if Israel was under attack. The current administration's, I don't know. I don't know what he would do.
Well,
as far as ISIS, I just wanted to briefly tell you, I talked to a friend of mine who's a pastor in Lubbock. His name's Dan Cressman. He said that 20 miles from his house on a little airstrip, an Osprey helicopter landed. That's pretty unusual. They've discovered military trucks carrying tons of razor wire into very remote areas of Texas. They've seen UN vehicles traveling through there, brand new tanks, and all other kinds of armored vehicles. They've taken over several Walmarts and used them has confiscated them as military bases in Texas. And then a friend of Dan's that he knows really well told me that, he said, you know, Dan, I'm just telling you this because this was very strange. He said, I was hired by the military to go into one of these facilities and build this machine. And he said, well, what was it? He said, it was a guillotine. And his job was to assemble two of them. And then he said what was really creepy is that in these Walmarts there was a black curtain that you couldn't see behind that was kind of like a private area. And he said they've taken off the front door situation and put just a small door like a TSA portal in the front for people to get in and out. And we really don't know what they're planning.
Well, you're exactly right. It reminds me of Haman, so to speak, or the Book of Ruth. I like the thing. Matter of fact, I think Netanyahu actually told Obama about the Book of Ruth.
I wouldn't doubt it. I think they've had a number of theological discussions.
Okay, we'll say that. But it
well,
is,
the whole idea of Haman or Haman and Amalek, you know, as far as being an Esther, those Torah codes come up multiple times from Esther. In fact, there's another code that we showed recently where way back in the 50s, Rabbi Michael Duff Weissmandel, who's most credited for discovering equidistant letter sequencing, had decided he would count how many letters were in the scroll of Esther, and there were 12,111 characters. So Gladerson decided he would just put that number into the Torah code computer, and he ended up with this phrase that said, the scroll. And when he looked down the same sentence next to the word the scroll, it said Esther.
Oh, my goodness.
Wow.
So stuff like that they're really happening. We're not making this stuff up.
Well, let me ask you, and you don't have to answer me, Richard, if it's a project ongoing, But have you guys, this rabbi that had this experience in the cave of Elijah, have y'all ran a code at all or tried to on that?
Oh, I don't know if Glazerson did an actual Torah code about it. He's been finding all sorts of codes about terror events in Iran and all sorts of things. It's on his website. He sends me some 1 or 2 new codes every day. And then, of course, we had the Gematria piece that you've seen that is quite fascinating. I don't know what to make out of it. We keep coming up with the same number, 776, in almost any scripture that they pulled up.
Wow.
It says the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they add up the gematria of those Hebrew characters, and it comes up to 776, and it says, come back to me like naughty children, from the book of Jeremiah, and that gematria of that phrase in Hebrew comes up to 776. Goes through this long column of sentences, finally gets down to the bottom, and it says, return of the Messiah, and it says 776. So I said, so what does that mean? Are we to assume that it's 5776? And he said it's basically implied because according to all of the ancient mystical Jewish texts, the Messiah is supposed to return in the 6th millennium, and that's what we're in right now. So we don't know if this is a prediction or a warning or one of those things where, the season we're supposed to know. We don't know the time or the date, but we're getting some clues here that we've never gotten before. I just think that's kind of interesting.
It is. Wow, that's amazing. Well, Dan, where are we going with book 2? Don't give anything away, but are we going to Mexico?
Yeah, book 1 takes place in Gaza when a team that's sent by the president to evaluate this intelligence they have that ISIS is going to use tunnels to attack the United States finds out that the information is true, and then the book 1 ends with the team, which is made up of a born-again a female CIA agent, a black Navy SEAL, an FBI counterterrorist agent, a Latino DEA agent, and an Israeli intelligence officer from the Givati Brigade are then dispatched to Mexico. And the rest of the action takes place along the border between Tijuana and San Diego. And I can tell you that book 1 is a really, really exciting read. Book 2 makes it look like kindergarten.
Oh, my.
Whoa.
Oh. Well, Dan, I have to say that my eye right now even is on that southern border that's just wide open, and I hope you have time to do book 2 before things break loose. I'll tell you what.
I do hope people will go to Amazon and Barnes & Noble and buy Day of the Dead book 1 and then read it. And if it makes sense to them, make noise about it. Demand answers from your Congress people and say, this scenario could happen to us. What are we doing about it? Because we're going to be in it.
Right, and I would tell people, I've had a lot of people, Dan, email me or call me sometimes. What if something happens? What can I do? Well, let me tell people. I'll tell you, folks, right now. Go buy 2 books, 2 copies of Day of the Dead by Dan Gordon, and read one for yourself and see what you might have to do in a situation you can't even hardly imagine or wrap your mind around in America that is portrayed in his book over in Israel and Gaza. But at the same time, the other book you bought, send it to your congressman. Send it to your congressman. That's just my opinion. But that's what needs to be done.
Real quickly, Larry, I was talking to Gil Broussard the other day, who's a real theologian, and he said he believes there's going to be a mass exodus to Israel from America.
That would not surprise me. Matter of fact, Joe Biden made a very interesting statement not too long back at a gathering of Jewish folks, I believe of New York or somewhere in that area, and he said the only place you're going to be saved is in Israel. And I thought, isn't that a telling word? And then Benjamin Netanyahu said in France, come home. He's telling people, come home.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, during the last war, I met a very elegant woman from Paris, a Jewish woman who had come to live in Israel, and we were speaking, and you could tell she had been a fashion model. She was very beautiful, and I said, what are you doing here? And she said, well, I had a very successful career in France. I was in the fashion industry. I started as a model, then I had my own fashion house, and I was very, very successful. And I said, oh, so that's lovely. So you're here on a vacation, enjoying, the summer weather or something? And she said, no. She said, you have to understand, Europe is finished for the Jews. She said, that's it. It's over. And it was such a deadly comment. To think that someone would say that within the lifetime of those who lived through the Holocaust and thought that was over, and then to see what's happening in Europe today, Israel exists for a reason, and that it is the one safe haven for the Jews, and it's also the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And in that sense, it's important to Jews and Gentiles alike. That Genesis quote of "He who blesses Israel will be blessed," I don't believe that is there coincidentally.
That's it. Listen, guys, this has absolutely been powerful and just incredible. I appreciate Dan so much. We've only got like 50 seconds left in the show. This has went so fast. Richard, thank you so much for calling in. You've added much to the conversation. Dan,
my pleasure.
Dan, do you have people should just go to Amazon and Barnes and Noble? And what about the movie? Is that coming soon?
Movie is, as they say right now, the script is written. I sold the movie rights, wrote the screenplay, and we're out to A-list directors. And so the first step is to get ourselves a director on board and then go after a movie star. And in the best of circumstances, you're looking at probably a 2-year process. But we're on that road right now.
Oh, man, I tell you, this has been great. Dan, I again want to say I thank you so much for coming on this evening. And Richard, I thank you so much for joining us. And listen, folks, read that book, Day of the Dead, Book 1, Gaza. Get it and read it. Thank you, guys,
Thank you so
and
much.
goodbye.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you. God bless.
Shalom.
Shalom. Shalom.